Now that you are expert in all things hypothalamic, the headquarters of homeostasis, the manager of the autonomic nervous system, its role in limbic system functions such as learning, memory, and emotions, and also by way of those releasing and inhibiting hormones, the chief of all endocrinology. Well, let's travel down the road from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, also called the hypophysis. There are two parts to the pituitary gland. The adenohypophysis, the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It is called adeno because adeno means gland. It is made of glandular epithelium, which arises from tissues of the embryonic throat. It will join together with a downgrowth from the hypothalamus, which we call the neurohypophysis because it consists of nervous tissue. So the two together sit in this little fossa of the sphenoid bone, which we call the sella turcica, the Turkish saddle. Notice that that is immediately posterior to the sphenoidal sinus, and it sits just over the nasopharynx. Well, when we have these releasing and inhibiting hormones made by the hypothalamus, they travel by way of the hypothalamo-hypophysio portal system to the adenohypophysis, where there are cells with receptor sites for those releasing and inhibiting hormones. So I have mentioned to you the somatotropes. They will bind growth hormone releasing hormone. They also bind growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So we have our production of growth hormone from those somatotropes when they are so stimulated by the releasing and inhibiting hormones of the hypothalamus. We also have in the adenohypophysis thyrotropes when they are stimulated by thyrotropin releasing hormone of the hypothalamus. They release thyroid stimulating hormone into the blood. We also have corticotropes in the adenohypophysis when they are stimulated by corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. They release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, into the blood. Also in the adenohypophysis, we have mammotropes when they bind the prolactin releasing hormone or the prolactin inhibiting hormone, they release prolactin into the blood. Also located in the adenohypophysis, we have the gonadotropes. So when gonadotropin releasing hormone comes rolling down infundibulum boulevard to the adenohypophysis, the GnRH will bind to those gonadotropes, and they in turn release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and also LH, luteinizing hormone, into the blood. So those are the hormones produced by the adenohypophysis. There is also one other which used to be listed as a pituitary hormone. It no longer is. It was called melanocyte stimulating hormone. It was observed to be active in other animals and assumed to be active in humans, but I think more recent research has indicated that there really is no melanocyte stimulating hormone in people. Okay, so if we take those hormones from the adenohypophysis, don't forget that we have two hormones that are stored in the neurohypophysis. Those are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. So those are the hormones of the pituitary gland, sometimes called the master gland, because those hormones will control the activities of several other glands in the body. So we have what we call axes, a hypothalamo hypophysio somatic axis. Well, that would be growth hormone. We have a hypothalamo hypophysio thyroid axis. Well, these are just continuums from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the target tissue. So let's go to the next slide and have a look at those axes. Okay, here we go with the hypothalamo-hypophysio axis or axes. Start there with the hypothalamus. We have those releasing and inhibiting hormones that travel by way of the portal system to the anterior pituitary, in which we have cells called somatotropes. When growth hormone releasing hormone or growth hormone inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus binds to those somatotropes, the somatotropes of the anterior pituitary release into the blood growth hormone. Growth hormone will have receptor sites on the epiphyseal plates of the bones, muscle tissue, cartilage tissue, and even fat and the organs of the abdominal and thoracic cavities. So that is the axis from the hypothalamus to the adenohypophysis to the target tissues. The next one there, prolactin. Remember, we started in the hypothalamus with prolactin releasing hormone or prolactin inhibiting hormone. There are cells in the anterior pituitary gland that are called mammotropes. When those hormones bind to the mammotropes release into the blood prolactin. The receptor sites for prolactin in the female are the mammary glands. Prolactin has a different effect in males, ultimately resulting in increased testosterone production, consequently increased sperm production. We'll talk about that later. Right now, just go with the axis from the hypothalamus to the adenohypophysis to the target tissues. Next, we have in the anterior pituitary cells that are called gonadotropes. When the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, it binds to those gonadotropes and they release into the blood two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. We will talk about the effects of those two hormones in both the male and female as we get to it. For now, just recognize the axis. Another axis that we have, the hypothalamus has or releases a hormone called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. In the anterior pituitary, there are cells called corticotropes. When the corticotropes bind the corticotropin releasing hormone, then they release their own hormone into the blood, and that is called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, stimulating the cells of the adrenal cortex. Next, we have in the axis a hormone from the hypothalamus called thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. It binds to cells in the anterior pituitary called thyrotropes. When that happens, the thyrotropes release into the blood TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. All right, so those are the hormones in the hypothalamo-hypophyseal axis. So let's take them up individually and make sure your understanding of those is complete. The other two we have already talked about, oxytocin and ADH. Those are stored in the posterior pituitary, so they are not in this particular axis that we are examining here. Okay, just to repeat just a little bit about the growth hormone released from the adenohypophysis. That hormone is also called somatotropin. Sometimes it is called somatotropic hormone, STH. Somato just means body. Trope means to stimulate, oftentimes to stimulate to grow. So that is the effect of growth hormone on the body. So you can see here the arrows that point to muscle growth and bone growth. The thing that you want to be wise to here is that growth hormone itself, oddly enough, is released when a person is sleeping. So while a person sleeps, growth hormone is released from the pituitary gland, but it has a very short half-life in the blood. I'm thinking that time is 20 minutes. That sounds a little bit extreme, but I think it is correct. I think the actual half-life of growth hormone in the blood, it's going to be removed from the blood by the kidneys, or at least half of it will be, in about 20 minutes. So how is it going to have its effect on the target tissues when it has such a short half-life? Well, it turns out that the growth hormone released by the pituitary gland has receptor sites in the liver. And when the hormone binds to those receptor sites, the liver releases a hormone called insulin-like growth factor, ILGF, which actually accomplishes what we attribute to growth hormone. So the growth hormone stimulates the release of ILGF, which has a longer half-life in the blood, therefore has a more sustained effect, stimulating the epiphyseal plates and stimulating the muscles, etc. And so consequently, we actually get our growth as a result of the ILGF. So just remember that, because we'll talk about it again when we talk about the liver. Okay, so that is our little look at growth hormone. Let's go on to the next hormone of the adenohypophysis. So what about those thyrotropes that are located in the adenohypophysis? Well, when stimulated to do so by TRH, they release TSH into the blood. The receptor sites for thyroid stimulating hormone obviously are at the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, as you can see, is located just below the voice box, wrapping around the trachea about 2/3 of the way. In the little insert there, you can see the thyroid gland from the back side, which is where you would find the usually 4 little islets called the parathyroid glands. There are usually 4 of them. Some people have variable numbers and even variable locations of parathyroid glands. Anyway, so you can see the anatomy. It has a right and a left lobe, and the crossing over part is called the isthmus of the thyroid gland. On the right side, I have shown a histological view of thyroid tissue so that you can see the follicular cells. Notice that they are simple cuboidal epithelial cells. A follicle is a fluid-filled bubble. Well, that's what we're looking at here. So those follicular cells are surrounding a fluid-filled space. So that's why we call it a follicle. Well, the fluid that's in the space is a protein called thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is the protein that is synthesized by those follicular cells. So it fills up the space and forms these bubbles or follicles on the thyroid gland. Thyroid stimulating hormone binds to those follicular cells and stimulates the production of thyroid hormone. Now, we have the protein called thyroglobulin. What we're going to add to it are 4 iodines. So the actual thyroglobulin consists of 2 amino acids. I'm sorry, it's one amino acid, but there are 2 of them. The amino acid is tyrosine. There are 2 of them. We will bind to those 2 tyrosines 4 iodines. So this is what the follicular cells do. They make the thyroglobulin, the protein, and then they bind 4 iodines to that. We will call that thyroid hormone, also called tetraiodothyronine, also called thyroxine. Now I'm pointing all of this out because I have given you an assignment to be done on PhysioX. And in the assignment that I gave you to do on PhysioX, you've got rats. And one of the rats doesn't have a pituitary gland. Another of the rats doesn't have a thyroid gland. Well, let me ask you a question. If a rat doesn't have a pituitary gland, then the rat doesn't release thyroid stimulating hormone. If you don't release thyroid stimulating hormone, then the thyroid gland doesn't make thyroxine, its hormone. If we don't make thyroxine, then the basal metabolic rate of all of the cells of our body slows down. So that is the effect of thyroid hormone, but we only make thyroid hormone if the follicular cells are stimulated by TSH, which is produced only if the hypothalamus makes TRH. All right, so when you play with your little rats on the PhysioX exercise, then be wise to that. If the rat doesn't have a pituitary gland, then it doesn't make TSH. Now we have another rat in that same exercise that has a pituitary gland, but it doesn't have a thyroid gland. Well, if you don't have a thyroid gland, what is the TSH going to bind to? If the thyroid stimulating hormone doesn't have a thyroid gland to bind to, then it's not going to produce thyroxine. So again, the basal metabolic rate of the body will go down. So I just wanted to point that out because I figure some of you are working on your little PhysioX exercise, and those are things that you need to know. Okay, so it is the follicular cells that have the receptor sites for TSH and consequently produce thyroid hormone, also called T4, also called tetraiodothyronine, also called thyroxine. Now notice also in this view, there are some other cells. The parafollicular cells, or the clear cells, sometimes they're just called C cells, C standing for clear. Those parafollicular cells make a hormone also, but it has nothing to do with thyroid hormone. That hormone is called calcitonin. We'll talk about it later. So right now we're just talking about the hypothalamo-hypophysio-thyroid axis, and that would result in the production of thyroxine, T4, tetraiodothyronine, and its effect on the body's basal metabolic rate. Well, this little design here is only focusing on the effect of prolactin in the female, but that's okay. We can make up for that with just a few other things said about males. First of all, the axis there, the hypothalamus, makes prolactin releasing hormone and also prolactin inhibiting hormone. So the receptor sites for that in the pituitary gland are called mammotropes. When stimulated to do so, the mammotropes release prolactin into the blood. In the female, the receptor sites for prolactin are the mammary glands, so we get mammary gland development during pregnancy. The mammary glands enlarge and develop, and we get the production of milk for the purpose of feeding the offspring. Now, in the male, prolactin does not have receptor sites at the mammary glands. Rather, it stimulates the production of testosterone, consequently, the production of sperm. One reason why I point that out is because there are men who hypersecrete or who hyposecrete prolactin. So when you have a male who is secreting too much prolactin, or secreting too little, then you can guess there will be some sexual dysfunction. As a matter of fact, several sexual dysfunctions are associated with both hypersecretion and hyposecretion of prolactin in males. Okay, from the hypothalamus, the hormone is called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. The cells of the anterior pituitary are called corticotropes. When the corticotropes are stimulated by the CRH from the hypothalamus, they release into the blood ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will stimulate cells of the adrenal cortex. The word cortex means outer portion. So the adrenal glands have an outer portion called a cortex and an inner portion called a medulla. It's kind of like the pituitary gland. Remember I told you the pituitary gland consists of nervous tissue, the neurohypophysis, and it also consists of epithelial tissue, the adenohypophysis. The adrenal glands have a similar design. The cortex of the adrenal glands is epithelial tissue. The medulla, the inner portion of the adrenal glands, those are modified nerve cells. They're actually part of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, have a look here at your illustration to see where the adrenal glands sit. They actually sit on top of the kidneys, so their name would properly be suprarenal glands, and you will come across that in certain textbooks. They're called suprarenal because they sit on top of the kidneys. Adrenal says beside the kidneys. Well, they're not beside, they're on top of. As a matter of fact, they're kind of crunched in between the top of the kidneys and the diaphragm. So it's really kind of snug and tight there. All right, so the adrenal glands located where they are, laid out with a cortex and a medulla. We're talking about only the cortex here. the medulla releases other hormones. The adrenal medulla releases epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about the adrenal cortex. So in the image to the far right, that's a microscopic view or a histologic view of the adrenal cortex. Looking at the cortex, the outer portion of the adrenal glands under the microscope, one can see three different layers. The zona glomerulosa, that means the neighborhood of little balls. Well, the zona glomerulosa releases hormones called mineralocorticoids. The middle layer is called the zona fasciculata. A fascicle is, what is the word for a fascicle? Zona fasciculata, threads. Yeah, neighborhood of little threads. And then the innermost layer is the zona reticularis. A reticularis is a meshwork or a net. So whoever was looking at these under the microscopes said, looky here, we have a neighborhood of little balls, and we have a neighborhood of little threads, and this neighborhood here looks like, kind of a net or meshwork. The zona glomerulosa releases mineralocorticoids when stimulated by ACTH. The zona fasciculata releases hormones that are called glucocorticoids when stimulated by ACTH. The zona reticularis releases androgenic steroids. Androgenic means causes maleness. Ooh. Yeah, so we have a precursor of testosterone, which is released in both males and females from the zona reticularis of the adrenal cortex. We will talk about those in greater detail. For now, just recognize the axis from the hypothalamus to the hypophysis to the adrenal cortex. Again, the hypothalamus makes GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which binds to cells in the anterior pituitary called gonadotropes. The gonadotropes release two hormones into the blood. They are follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, which is shown on this slide. We'll talk about luteinizing hormone on the next slide. Right now, we have follicle stimulating hormone and its target in the female. Well, I said earlier when talking about the thyroid gland that a follicle is a bubble that is filled with a fluid. Well, it turns out that the ovaries have those. So those are the ovarian follicles in which the reproductive cell, which we call an egg, is developing. Well, in the female, FSH stimulates the maturation, growth, and development of those ovarian follicles. Ultimately, the follicle, which contains the egg, will rupture. That is called ovulation. In the male, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the seminiferous tubules to make sperm cells. So this is one of the hormones of pubescence. So when a child becomes reproductively able, then it is the follicle stimulating hormone that is kind of leading the way here. But remember, the follicle stimulating hormone is only released when the hypothalamus says the time is right. So a child enters into pubescence according to the timing that the hypothalamus has set for that to happen. In the female, that would typically be about age 10 or 11. In the male, that is typically about age 11, 12, 13, slightly later. Interestingly enough, the hypothalamus can be affected by another hormone which is released by fat cells. That hormone is called leptin. If a female child is obese and the levels of leptin are high in that child, she very well may undergo pubescence prematurely. So we might have a 6-year-old first grade girl who becomes reproductively able. She shows up in class with lipstick on in the first grade. What's this miniskirt she's got on? My goodness, look at the way she's walking. So she has gone from being a girl to a woman at a very young age, and that relationship appears to be uh, to the level of leptin, which is produced by fat cells. So the hypothalamus itself can be influenced by leptin levels and the onset of puberty consequently affected. Okay, let's move on to luteinizing hormone on the next slide. The gonadotropes of the adenohypophysis, when stimulated by gonadotropin-releasing hormone, release not only FSH, but also LH, luteinizing hormone, into the blood. Lut means yellow. Well, I will explain how that comes into play in just a minute. So just notice here how the luteinizing hormone has its effect in the female. It is the surge of LH at about day 14 of the monthly cycle, which prompts the follicle to rupture and the egg to be released. So it is that sudden blast of LH in the female that causes ovulation. So the egg jumps out of the follicle and into the fallopian tube at about day 14 of the monthly cycle. So it is luteinizing hormone in the female that prompts ovulation. In the male, luteinizing hormone stimulates testosterone production, consequently, sperm production. So those are the effects. Now, there's one thing I wanted to, written in red over here, it says LH regulates ovulation. Well, that's true. The second part, and maintains pregnancy, not really. LH causes ovulation after the follicle ruptures at the time of ovulation. What's left on the surface of the ovary is colored yellow. That's why it's called luteinizing hormone. The yellow spot that's left on the ovary, it's actually the scar that's left on the ovary after the follicle ruptures, is called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum releases its own hormone, and that hormone is called progesterone. So as far as maintaining pregnancy, which is attributed to LH, I would put that in parentheses. It's actually progesterone, but the progesterone is made by the corpus luteum, which is the scar that remains on the surface of the ovary after the follicle ruptures. Well, this stuff will all come up again when we start talking about reproductive physiology, but you should be knowledgeable about it even now. Okay, on the next slide, I will just summarize all of this and we can move on from there. Well, this is a pretty convenient little summary here, but there are some things that I want to add to it and remind you of things that I have previously said. So let's look here at growth hormone. Don't forget, growth hormone has a very short half-life in the blood, so the actual growth effect of that hormone is accomplished by insulin-like growth factor, which is released by the liver. So don't overlook that. The next hormone there, prolactin, that is only referring to the effect of prolactin in the female. I told you that prolactin also has an effect in males, and when there is hyper or hyposecretion of prolactin in males, there are some sexual dysfunctions that are seen as a result of that. Thyroid stimulating hormone, that's okay, stimulates thyroid hormone release. We will carry that out to its end point later. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates hormone release by the adrenal cortex. Well, that includes mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and also androgenic steroids, depending on which layer of the adrenal cortex we're talking about. Follicle stimulating hormone that stimulates gamete production. It stimulates gamete production in males. Those are the sperm cells. As far as females go, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the maturation and development of the follicle. The follicle is not the gamete, the egg is the gamete. So don't get those confused. It does stimulate sperm production in males, but it stimulates follicle maturation in the females. Luteinizing hormone, it says here, stimulates androgen production. Androgens are masculine hormones. So in the male, luteinizing hormone does stimulate the production of testosterone. So that is correct. In the female, luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation, the release of the egg from the follicle, consequently the formation of the corpus luteum, consequently the production of progesterone. All right, these next two, antidiuretic hormone stimulates water reabsorption by the kidneys. That is correct. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions at the time of labor and delivery. That is correct. It also stimulates milk ejection from the mammary glands, and it is also the hormone that is associated with, my mama told me not to talk about things like this, but orgasm. Don't tell her I said that, okay? All right, here, this last thing I mentioned in a previous slide, humans do not make melanocyte stimulating hormone. It has historically been listed as a pituitary hormone because it is so in other animals. Things like a peacock that have these marvelous color designs and things like that, their melanocytes are stimulated by this hormone to give them their unique coloration. It was assumed that humans also had melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulated by a hormone called melanotropin from the hypothalamus. Turns out the area of the pituitary gland, which is called the zona, I'm sorry, the pars intermedia, what they call here the intermediate zone. There is no such thing in the human pituitary gland. The pars intermedia has simply been overgrown by and overtaken by the pars distalis, which is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So it is listed, and you will see it and perhaps hear about melanocyte stimulating hormone being released by the human pituitary gland, but current evidence indicates that there is no such thing. Okay, there is one other secretion of the anterior pituitary gland, which is not listed here and normally isn't, and that is the neurotransmitter that we call beta endorphin. So it is the corticotropes, the same cells of the anterior pituitary gland that make ACTH. They also release beta endorphin, which is called an endogenous opioid or a pain relieving secretion. So that also is part of the pituitary activity. It's not usually listed as one of the pituitary hormones, but that's where the beta endorphin actually comes from. Okay, well, that's all I've got for today. I've pretty much talked myself into a sore throat, so I'll try again tomorrow.